Okay, I would like to welcome everyone to today's Docuhistory Q&A with Walter Greason and Kevin Gannon. I'm going to begin just quickly with introductions. Dr. Walter D. Greason is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Educational Counseling and Leadership at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey. As a fellow New Jersey person, I'm very happy that we have Jersey representing. He is also an honors dean emeritus who has now published 6 books in the last decade. That's incredible. His research focuses on slavery, segregation, and globalization since 1750, with a specific emphasis on using historic preservation to lead reinvestment campaigns in small towns. His social media account, which my guess is most of you know, is @WorldProfessor on Twitter, and it reaches millions of people worldwide every day. Kevin Gannon, our other guest today, is professor of history and director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa. He is the author of Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto from West Virginia University Press, and is currently writing a continental history of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras for Routledge, and he tweets at the Tattooed Professor or the Tattooed Prof. One of the reasons I'm very excited for this Q&A is that both Professor Greason and Professor Gannon are dedicated to thinking about history across the K-16 spectrum, and they are dedicated to thinking about education and pedagogy and using the two to help us all think about how we can use the past to reimagine the future in which we dismantle these systems of racism and oppression. So I'm going to begin, and it was very exciting as the chat kind of filled up with questions. The first 2 questions are actually being posed by students through a couple of folks. So the first question is, one question from my students: how should young people, unable for one reason or another, parents, transportation, etc., unable to take part in the protests, become involved and be advocates for change?
You want to take it first, Kev?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and one, I think, the film itself certainly sparks, the sense that, there is so much work to be done, and how do we get about doing it? I think start where you are, with your own education, with, what media you're consuming, how you're consuming it, what voices are making that media. I think one thing that I've had some really interesting conversations about with my own children, who are junior high and high schoolers themselves, is, the stuff that we're watching on a daily basis, especially online, who's creating that content and what viewpoints does it represent? What is ours? And especially for those of us who identify as white, it's very easy to be in sort of an unconscious bubble in terms of the ways that we intersect with the larger world. Then there's also things that we could do. I think one of the really fascinating and for me very positive things that's coming out of what's happening in Minneapolis is a critique of policing presence in schools. And so in your school, how does your school look at discipline? Is your school a building that has racial disparities when it comes to things like suspensions and expulsions? Are there conversations that are happening about things like restorative justice and other ways of sort of non-punitive, non-justice system types of discipline? Those are really great questions to be asking, and there are probably allies among the faculty and staff of the buildings that you could be working on those with too. And then local politics. Everything is local. And so when we look at, school boards, and when we look at who's making decisions about curricula, and we look at, what am I learning and how am I learning it and what am I being told I can do with this knowledge? Those are the types of questions to ask from a critical way that can help you start to get some traction under real meaningful change.
And so for me, it's really similar, but I'm going to take kind of 2 complementary tracks to what Kevin had laid out. For young people, it's really important by middle school that they figure out how do they make an impact in their local community, beyond their family, beyond their household. And so in my life and in the work that I've done for more than 30 years, it starts with just 1 or 2 people in a phone conversation or an email exchange, text message or DM that there's a good idea and they see a need. And with like just a couple dollars, $5, $20, the first campaign I was a part of started with $13 and I was 12 years old. And we were coming out and collecting food, remaindered food from grocery stores to distribute to needy families that carried them for like 2 weeks till the end of the month. These kinds of small scale initiatives for me are profoundly transformative. And when teachers and administrators endorse them and back them up, by the time my senior year of high school, we had like a fleet of trucks distributing tons of food to hundreds of families off of that same premise. And so taking the chance and finding the way where just you and a friend or a couple friends get together and start to address hunger or homelessness, energy co-ops so that people's electric and oil bills go down. These kinds of things are accessible for young people to do, especially with the support of educational leadership, of community leadership. And all of that lays a foundation for some of the theoretical things we can do as scholars, that we need to reorient our sense of the possible. And that to me is one of the core stories that comes out of 13th, is that the Confederacy and the people who had advocated for states' rights and fought to defend slavery had a profound imagination about how to restore their lost cause. And they were extraordinary about, and ruthless, violent about pursuing that vision for a century. And we live with the consequences of it. And that's been probably the most frequent thing I've talked about in the last week, is that we have underestimated for 50 years the people committed to maintaining inequity. That there is just step after step and stride and obstacle deciding to make sure we do not reach the goal of a fair and equal system. And until we confront those people and those institutions and dismantle them purposefully with both the ideas and the scholarship that we undertake, but also with our actions within our own institutions, don't be surprised when our grandkids come back to a moment like this 50 years from now.
So the next question from a student is also through their parent. My 13-year-old son who joined me in watching the film would like to know, this long history of criminalizing Black and brown bodies is largely absent from K-12 education. Why is that? So why has this history, much of which is presented in 13th, absent from so many curriculums throughout the country? I see Kevin just preparing to go.
Because it's absent from so many other places. And that's the truth of it, right? So most of the power structure over education, over our public and civic discourse, for example, has been dominated by white people. And that's been true and still remains true, although not to the same extent today as it has in the past. And so where are those decisions being made about what education is supposed to teach and who's supposed to learn it and how they're supposed to learn it? And this historical process of the criminalization of Black and brown bodies, of the land of the free and the home of the brave, but the first recourse is to violence and punitive policing. Those historical processes make people uncomfortable. And if decision makers are uncomfortable and can't honestly reckon with the past and what produced the structures in which they're operating in, they're not going to put those processes in things like school curricula. And that's, to me, the best history is subversive. And I know that that's a word that sort of conjures up images of people in black masks and narco-terrorism or something like that. But subversive in the true sense of the term, it's subverting the dominant paradigm or the dominant narrative. We always need that, because if we don't have anything that's challenging that dominant narrative, we don't have the stories to tell that enable us to imagine something different. To piggyback on the point that Walter made, what are we imagining ourselves to be, and what are we imagining our possibilities, our potential futures to be? Because the tools that give us the ability to do that imagining are from history. And so if we aren't able to honestly reckon with our history and are speaking, expansively, broadly, society-wide, if we are not able to honestly reckon with that, then there are tools that we cannot use. We either don't know they're there or we refuse to use them to construct different futures.
So I'll point at something really particular, right? That whether it's P-12 education or the higher ed, every set of professional ambitions we have, there are structures of how we advance along that path, and things we should not do and things that we should do that are communicated to us hopefully clearly by mentors, people guiding us through the system that have come before. We need to very seriously look at the structures of incentives and disincentives that prevent us from pursuing a more just and equitable world. And I'm very much on this line about material rewards, that the way that salary bonuses come up, the way that people gain tenure, the way that grants are awarded, the way that we give someone a plaque at the end of the year to say that you've done extraordinary work. Many of the cases of the people who organize behind the scenes of what we're seeing happen in our country, there's no reward for it. There's extraordinary risk that you can go to jail, you can be injured, you can be killed. You see the images of these people taking their lives into their hands to bring us into a freer day. But we don't have a structure within our schools or within our businesses to say, we are proud of you and we need you to do more in terms of building institutions of justice and equality. That's the kind of thing that is the hardest obstacle for me in the work I've done, is that taking on the additional risk beyond the requirements of doing your job as an educator or as a business person, as a banker, the kind of zero-sum material gains of being ruthless and being unjust are really, really pronounced. And we don't have a similar reward structure. We have a very defined punishment structure for folks who want to believe in social equity and believe that, fairness and democracy should prevail.
And I'll say one other thing on that too, that Walter's excellent point made me think of. If you are in a position of power or privilege in your institution, this is your work to do. So I am a white male, tenured full professor at my institution. How am I supporting this work, and how am I supporting the colleagues that are doing this work? This can't be things that we unload on the new teachers or on our colleagues, who come from communities of color. This is everybody's work to do. And if you are in a position where you can help support and advance and even protect some of the people doing that work, in addition to doing that work yourself, I think that's an ethical imperative for us in education to be thinking about.
So here's a very practical, but I think important question for teachers. Can you suggest either a U.S. history textbook for secondary classes that supports the film that we just watched and includes more inclusive narratives? Or if a textbook isn't possible, are there texts that help to provide narratives that will help us all to build a more inclusive narrative in our, let's start with U.S. history surveys.
So I'll just jump right in. I haven't taught survey in a really long time, so then hopefully are better works than what I'm about to say. But the American Social History Projects, We Built America, Volume 1 and 2, are just beautiful, extraordinary textbooks designed to deal with a lot of the really painful issues that have been ignored, the contradictions and the questions that can be raised, allowing students to find their own conclusions about the problems they face in today's world, but are based in some of the historical decisions their parents and grandparents made. That's one place I would start the conversation with. American Social History Project, We Built America.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I know that right now, because I actually do some work with ASHP, they're working on taking Who Built America and making it into an OER digital resource. I'm not sure exactly the timeline for that, but definitely add Who Built America to your list. There are many different volumes of it. I believe Herbert Gutman is listed as the primary author, but there will be a new OER version sometime in the near future.
Well, that's the best news I've heard all day, because I'm right there with Walter. I've used Who Built America teaching the survey for years. I've paired it with some other texts at times. I've used Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which isn't without some of its problems, but also I think is a way of narrating and approaching history that leads to some really rich metacognitive work that we can do with students in terms of whose story gets told. and really pushing back against the idea of objectivity, because none of us are coming from an objective position. And I don't think that it's too early to start talking with students. I've had these conversations with junior high school history classes, for example, about, what is this idea of objectivity and what is that really used for, right? Because if Zen's not objective, then it's an easy way to sort of push those stories to the side. And I think that's a really good set of conversations to start having with students, and how agency and history are so fundamentally intertwined. Another good survey text that's out there that actually complements really well with Who Built America is Eric Foder's work, Give Me Liberty. And again, it's the thematic thread that he uses. It leads to some good discussions. It's a great sort of just narrative, and it's accessible, it's well written, it's comprehensive. It does a good job with social and cultural history and minorities history, but it's also a way that, again, you could talk with students about why did Foder make the choices to talk, how does he trace this concept of liberty, and its different meanings to different people, and what does that have to offer us today? So texts like Who Built America, like Zen, like Foder, that let us have those conversations with students to kind of peek under the hood a little bit. And then students aren't seeing history as just something that's passed down straight from the textbook to you. This is produced not just by historical actors and actresses themselves, but by those who are interpreting it. And let's talk about what that means and why that's important, and more importantly, why it's important for you now as someone who's becoming a historian.
Yeah, something that's a little advanced, and there are kind of two branches to this, just for me to kind of tell you how insane I am as an instructor for these courses. The first is there are the whole series of major problems in American history books. And for whatever kind of counter narrative or additional texture you'd like to add to these stories, the combination of both primary sources and then really outstanding secondary writers who have brought new research to the fore, the major problems books are really good for that. But I got in trouble 20 years ago when I first started teaching US Survey, and I took the major problems in American women's history textbook into the standard survey. They're like, why are you teaching women's history as part of the survey? And it's like, well, women are half of the population, and we need to hear not just the women of the primary sources, but the actual women historians and the extraordinary insight that they bring to the conversation. And since then, a lot of folks have told me, oh, why did we not think of that? And I'm like, we need to do more of it. And in this moment in particular, I'd be completely remiss not to mention John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom as the classic defining textbook for African American history that can be brought into a survey course. But my favorite actual textbook for African American history is Nell Painter's Creating Black Americans. And that combines a wide range of media resources, paintings, music, photography, sculpture, that bring history to life in a different way. And then, of course, I'm shameless plug. I have my last 4 books are all for survey and special topics usage that looks at the economics of American history, particularly in terms of racial segregation. And so if you're interested in any of those books, I'm sure it'll be part of all the social media that comes with this.
Joe, I know you want to move on to the next one, but I will say one more. The Bedford St. Martin's American History and Culture series is a great series for combining professionals' editorial scholarship with a rich set of primary sources, curated really well and structured in a way that makes them ideal for teaching. Professor Dubois here with us has an excellent volume on the Haitian Revolution that I use with both my US and my Modern World surveys when I teach that course. Students really like those volumes. They're inexpensive, which also helps. But they're a great way to get in and start doing history. There's just enough around them, but not so much that it smothers the actual documents themselves. So those are a really good resource I would recommend too.
Great. So since you both have spoken the kind of conceptual tools, and now we're talking about kind of very practical tools in terms of text, I really loved Walter's phrasing of our sense of the possible. And bringing up, both of you did, the idea of imagination and applying history to imagining the future. I'm going to ask a very specific question to you, Walter. Could you speak to one of your passions with Afrofuturism and how that can be a conceptual tool that we could even bring into, a secondary classroom to get students to imagine a different and ultimately better future?
So that's the topic that's swept my life down a new path the last 2 years. My last book was called Cities Imagined. It's the African diaspora in media and history, and so it's a counter take on how do we look at the architectural remnants of human civilization. And there's this narrative in our architectural history that there's really no architectural past for the African continent, certainly not for the African diaspora. And the book really attacks that pretty fiercely. And we intentionally designed it. We started it in like 2015. I'd been working with my co-editor, Julian Chambliss, back in 2007 or 8. But documenting the amazing variety of African and indigenous spaces over the last 500 years, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but on the African continent, in Europe, in Asia. And the book was a way to kind of get an entry point through what was Julian's specialty as comic studies. We were preparing it as we knew the world was going to get very excited about the idea of Black Panther and Wakanda. And that's where the Afrofuturism end of it comes in, is that what is the world if we don't see the kind of damage slavery and colonialism has done? Is it possible to imagine an African nation that is as advanced or more advanced than what we see in any Western or Eastern society? So that's a lot of where I get that language of the sense of the possible from. And so in doing Cities Imagined and doing the work that I've done the last year on Afrofuturist design, it's about the opposite of what we're seeing with the removal of Confederate monuments across the United States. It's about how do we actually find and preserve Black and indigenous communities that have largely been either contained or gentrified, if not displaced or in my work, erased entirely from the landscape. How do we kind of reverse the damage and restore the places that have been most kind of injured and the people who live there and carry this trauma going forward? So that's a lot of what I do. I'd say, you know, when I'm not teaching or doing admin work, 80% of what I'm doing is about building resources to restore the places that have been destroyed. And we just had a breakthrough where I was working with a group of people earlier today that were doing a huge project tied through New Orleans. There's another project that's built out of the Texas Freedom Colonies, the Plains, out through Iowa and Minnesota. There are dozens of these places, but we don't have histories of them. In fact, when I bring them up with different scholars, they're like, it's impossible. You can never put it back together. But I think we can. In fact, I know we can. I've done it here in New Jersey. And so that's me. It's not just Afrofuturism. Really, the group of people who are doing this are part of what's called the Black Speculative Arts Movement. I said it's a long phrase, but Black Speculative Arts, John Jennings is one, Yatasha Womack is another, Ronaldo Anderson, Tananarive Due, Jordan Peele, his rise in Hollywood has come using a lot of these ideas. And so that's what we're trying to shape for the next several decades, is a 21st version of what people called the Harlem or Chicago or Los Angeles Renaissance, that actually materially looks at reorienting the systems and the communities that have been lost.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and kind of go focus on using 13th in the classroom. There's a question about, and maybe Kevin, you can speak to, since I know you do some work in teaching world history as well now. How are ways either that you've used the film itself, the themes in the film, or aspects of 13th in a world history classroom?
That's a great question, because I think there are some pretty clear connections that we can use and help our students discern them more clearly. And so for me, so I also teach and research in Latin American history, and because I'm in a small department, I teach a lot of world history too, even though I was trained principally as a US historian. And in one of the ways that I'm trying to do justice to these fields with my students, and not just sort of play scholarly tourist, is to help them find and discern some of these connections with experience that we might see as perhaps just our own or just localized, and see that there are these broader global connections. And certainly, you know, in our present society, everything is so interconnected. It's, you know, it's almost a cliche to say it, but what does that really mean? And so one of the things that I think has worked really well using 13th is to take the themes of sort of carceral violence and the criminalization, the you know, weaponizing everything from social theory like sociology, race science, things like that, to help underlie this narrative of Black inferiority, Black criminality, and then put that on a broader context, say, well, isn't this how empire was maintained throughout, you know, across the globe? And so when we look at, you know, the wars of empire, the post-World War II decolonization movement, and, you know, really dive into what does it mean for, you know, Bandung countries, so-called third world countries, to be fighting against not just sort of the political and economic domination of colonialism, but this larger intellectual and cultural framework that has categorized their people as others. And the consequences that could be, you know, horrific and violent. And we see that, you know, not just during colonialism, but during decolonization, and then what happens with first world, third world relations. And so if we look at 13th and say, there is this arc of, you know, violence that stretches from the slave trade to enslavement to, you know, the end of slavery in the Civil War to the attempt to reestablish slavery through convict leasing. And then how is that arc of violence justified by those who are perpetrating it? How does it become so firmly entrenched in the political system? And then let's look internationally and see those same things as well. How do we see this arc of violence from colonialism to post-colonial societies remain intact, even if political frameworks change? So what is it about the power of these ideas and this discourse, or this set of discourses, that is keeping these frameworks so, you know, sunk into these societies? And also, I think, you know, just thinking about globalization as well. It's not just economics, right? It's ideas. And so let's look at, you know, the international protests we're seeing, you know, that are resonating around with the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor killings that we've seen in the US. And we're seeing solidarity demonstrations in places like Paris and Tokyo. So what does that mean? Right? There's something that's resonating there, and a lot of it has to do with the way that sort of global capitalism has been constructed and whose backs it was constructed on. And we see that both at home and abroad. So a lot of ways that I think that we could get students to really start actively thinking about our interconnected world and have that phrase mean something, as opposed to just be kind of this globalism cliche. Sorry, that was kind of a long-winded answer. I hope that made sense and was at least somewhat coherent.
That was great.
Well, now, can I jump on that too?
Absolutely.
No, the point where Kevin is talking about the ideological dimensions of globalization, it's so important. A few years back, people loved to talk about the notion of English as the language of business, and didn't really hold much account to how that was hegemonic, how like the notion of American domination financed by Western Europe had transformed the world, you know, especially since like the fall of the Soviet Union. And so for me, a lot of what I've tried to bring to my campus and wherever I can manage to get an invite, so you guys are now damaged by my presence in the same way, but like this notion that colonialism and industrialization are exclusive processes is a complete lie. And the way we have to understand and teach the way that they're tied together, so that when we understand the end of the Second World War and the reworking of the global order, that process over the last 70 years, 75 years, that has to be something where we're looking at not just the benefits of consumerism and technology, massive medical breakthroughs, but I think climate change gives us a way to start to offer a substantial critique, and the way that we look at energy dependence. And all of these things come into play as we look at what I deal with a lot is the financing of globalization. How do we look at a place like Davos? How do we look at massive financial institutions like the Bank of America? Things that are transnational institutions built on the principles that come out of the 19th century and have very little investment in the kinds of ways we talk about human rights. So the ideas of value or risk, these have nothing to do with what we individually suffer or what violence we see in our nightly news, but instead become parts of a portfolio, become parts of a way people measure the loss of human life as a kind of acceptable part of a commercial transaction. And so that's where I think we need to kind of look to a new set of texts as we teach world history, is that we can do a lot of the work with political economy, and we can critique the way that the ideological structures of the West respond to these challenges from Japan or China or India. But the overall sense of a global community and how that systemically works in a sustainable way is far more impoverished, and we need so much more of it. I've read a lot of the lit that leads to what's possible, but what's real is also different. And we need to do more to kind of experiment with structures that are not grounded in global financial capital, because it traps us. It limits the possibilities of what we can create.
So this is another question, kind of speaking to a very specific aspect of 13th, but I think an important one. Someone asked, how do they address some of the images that may be very upsetting, traumatizing to students in class in a film like 13th, or just so many of the images that are a part of this long and dark history of systemic racism?
Well, I could share what I do with my students when we watch it, and then with other groups at my university. You know, we do put out a kind of a content warning. You know, it's shocking students is not a good way to learn, right? And for some students, you know, violent images is something that, you know, there needs to be some preparation or some groundwork laid for. So we let them know that that's, and then in particular, I reference the end, because that sequence of camera footage and cell phone footage and such. And I remember, so I didn't see the film until its premiere for the first time in full. Several of us who were in it got brought to the premiere. And so I didn't know that that was coming, right? And I remember, you know, and me and everyone around me, that was one of the most profoundly affecting parts of the film. But I think for students, framing it in, you know, we're going to talk about why Ava DuVernay made this decision. And what that does to this narrative and to this thing. We're, you know, inviting students into the conversation to get them to think about the choices that were made in the production of the film, and then what we do. You know, why do these things make us so viscerally uncomfortable, particularly for those of us who are white or come from maybe more suburban or rural backgrounds, right? You know, these are experiences that are different, and we need to wrestle with the fact that our first reaction is one of discomfort, even beyond the violence. So let's talk about and let's think about, you know, where we are in terms of our own positionality. And I remember Ava say, you know, that they had gone back and forth, and it was very important to them to have the permission from all of the families, which is why you see that in the documentary. But she said she wanted to have that as witness because it is the story. You know, that's where the threads of what the story the documentary is telling, that is where these threads are playing out. But then the very conscious decision with the credits to have pictures of Black joy. Because I think one of the things that a lot of us who work in this area really struggle with is sort of violence porn, right? And are the only way that we're representing people of color are either dead or having violence inflicted upon them. And so where do we, you know, go for agency, and where do we go for complexity and for portraying full and complicated human beings? And I think holding those things in balance is really hard, but worth having that conversation with students both before and afterwards, processing what they've seen.
Yeah, for me, this is a central thing that comes out of the social media moment, that probably the most impactful thing I'll ever do in my life was a list of the actual narrative moments I had taught about racial violence. And I literally opened that whole accounting with saying, after I did it, I saw I could not do it that way again, and I had to come up with a different approach. So that's been a huge central point of the way that I teach my entire career now. And I think one basic tool that I use frequently to get at that content is that I have students read about a specific incident or set of incidents first. I have them write short responses to the reading that they've done. And then in doing the reading and the writing, to then encounter an image related to what the content they've thought about is, significantly lessens the blow, but also deepens the learning. And so I was a rookie back in 2002. I was just kind of figuring out how to do it. and just bombarding students with all the stuff I was so angry that they had never seen before. And after 6 weeks of it, every day was just it was so painful to watch them just weep and just struggle to say, I can't take it anymore. Don't show me anymore. I was like, it's important that we teach this, but I needed to invent a better way for me to approach it. And so I've learned over time that written words, whether read or created by our own hands, have a little bit of emotional distance. I mean, it's harder to really hit someone as powerfully as you can with an image, particularly a moving image, as you can with what you write. It takes more effort. It takes a lot more craft and skill to pull that off. Conversely, on the other side, I've found that you can amplify visceral happy or sad or angry reactions with both sound and food. And so like, there are these other tools that I've learned to kind of bring to the table for my classroom experiences that if I'm introducing something difficult, it's going to be reading and writing. And then as they move through and understand it, then they can start to grapple with the emotions that come up when they encounter Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. And then are dealing with, you know, what it would smell like at some of these sites when they've charred a human body. It's just, I've become a lot more careful and thoughtful about how to bring students into the lesson.
Thank you both so much. I did drop into the chat what I think is a very strong model from Kevin Boyle about presenting images such as this. If you want to take a look, it's from the website US History Scene, and it's powerful, just as your responses were, so thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I do want to say there are many, many amazing questions in the chat that unfortunately we won't get to today. Thank you, everyone.
Send them to us on Twitter, email.
Yeah, I
seriously.
definitely collect these and figure out a way to maybe get some responses. You know, I'm really thinking about kind of the pedagogy that you guys are presenting and just am blown away by it. So if there is some way to collect responses to some of these questions that we won't get to, but to kind of end on a note that hopefully is somewhat positive, but also points out the reality, I'm going to combine two questions. One person asked, why are so many of these laws in some form, like 3 strikes, like mandatory minimums, still on the books? Another person asked a question from their students of, why does ALEC still exist? Why is it legal? So I'm going to combine those two things and then leave us all with, if you could speak to, what can we do to maybe do something about the fact that these laws, the fact that an organization like ALEC still exists, what can we do to be civically active to change the world for the better? Small question.
Walter, you want to go ahead?
All right, yeah, man. in like 30 seconds, right? I'm
just trying to buy time.
Oh my gosh. So these pieces about what we can do, and it's come up over and over again this past week, is organize. I started on this point about finding a friend or two that you can talk to, you know, regularly to kind of build the way you intervene. But tapping into the resources that are regional or national are really important too. So a group like this is just a spectacular group of people who do amazing things already. But the way that we amplify each other or create efficiencies for each other and like I said before, reward each other for doing the things we're already doing or the things that we haven't even imagined yet that are possible because we've just met and kind of gotten together to do this. Those things are the way we counter it. And so there are a couple other pieces, but I have to close with like why ALEC functions the way it does. And this is kind of the thesis to the American economy book I wrote, is that I was struggling for a decade with why property was equivalent to life and liberty in the US Constitution. That when you talk about inalienable rights under the Declaration, it says life, liberty, pursue happiness. In the Fifth Amendment, pursuit of happiness turns into property. And I understand the logic of it, that you can't legally build a system around people pursuing happiness. And just, can you imagine if every Jerry Springer show was the basis of litigation? Like, it would not work. So property instead is a different thing. But we have not only made property equivalent to life and liberty, in my view, we've made property primary, and that our life and liberty is kind of contingent on the property that we acquire. And so that is unacceptable. That is, to me, counter to the entire philosophical underpinning of the experiment. And so if we find ways to restore that balance and, to me, make property third behind life and liberty in some very clear ways, I think we can move to a much, much better, safer, and equitable society.
Yeah, the short answer to why are these things still there is because we've let them be there. And again, we speaking broadly, property and jurisprudence in the United States, the 14th Amendment was meant to make citizenship national and to sort of constitutionally implant fundamental American rights that come with national citizenship. But for the rest of the 19th century, a very conservative Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment as applying to, as Mitt Romney said, corporations are people, my friends. So there's a long tradition. One of the things that I'm most proud of that I said in the film, and sort of a rare moment of clarity for me, was that, we are the product of the choices that have been made, right? And these were choices that were made. And I think one of the really important things for students to understand is, we have 3 strikes laws because they have not exceeded what a court has defined as exceeding the cruel and unusual punishment standard. These are not objective truths carved in stone, handed down from, God to Moses to the Supreme Court. These are shifting, changing interpretations that reflect the values of the people who framed them in the age in which they live. So in other words, they are part of this thing called history. They are choices that are being made, and not everybody has to agree with those choices. But the most important part is, and this gets into what do we do? All of this seems so overwhelming, especially in days like this. Choices can be unmade. We can choose differently. And whatever we decide to do in terms of where does my activist journey take me, education for me is my activism, my primary form. And, again, that doesn't mean we're indoctrinating. That means we're educating. Educate comes from the Latin educare, to draw forth, to draw out. What are we drawing out of our students? How are we drawing our students out into a world in which they don't just passively see it, but are able to critically intervene in their own reality, as Paulo Freire said, right? How do they understand that things don't just happen, that things are happening because of choices within broader structures? So how do we make different choices? And then how do I make different choices? And how do I help others make different choices than what we have now? So that's what we do, I think, as educators, is we draw our students forth into this place. And the study of history, I think, is uniquely suited to this, where we get them to think about their power, their agency, the choices that have been made, and the choices they can make. Let's tell different stories. Let's imagine different possibilities. And to do that, we have to know and to honestly and fundamentally reckon with the stories that have brought us here.
So I think that's a perfect place to end in thinking about these stories and how can we undo the choices that we have made. I want to thank Walter and Kevin so very much for your time, your expertise. Everything you said today was so powerful and just so necessary. Thank you very much. Of course, thank you to the forum. We will see folks in the near future. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.